It was an unseasonably warm autumn evening when Greg and his high school football team gathered for their final practice before the big game. They had chosen a forgotten old football field on the outskirts of town to avoid distractions, an abandoned place where no one had played for decades. The field had a haunting reputation, but Greg's coach, a hardened man with no belief in ghosts or curses, brushed off the warnings. The grass was overgrown, the goalposts rusted, and the bleachers rotting, but it was still functional enough for one last practice. As they warmed up under the fading sun, Greg noticed something strange, an eerie stillness in the air, as if the very field was watching them. But he shook it off, chalking it up to nerves before the championship. His teammates joked around, though they too cast uneasy glances at the surrounding woods, which seemed to close in tighter as the evening wore on. The team's star quarterback, Matt, was the first to voice his discomfort. "Coach, maybe we should practice somewhere else," he said, his voice uneasy. But the coach just laughed. "Don't tell me you're scared of a ghost story. Let's focus." Reluctantly, they started their drills, and for a while, it seemed like a normal practice. But as dusk settled, the temperature dropped rapidly. A thick, unnatural fog rolled in from the forest, enveloping the field in a cold, damp haze. Suddenly, the lights around the field flickered, dimming until only the faint glow of the moon lit the field. Greg's heart raced, but before he could say anything, something far more disturbing happened. A loud, bone-chilling screech echoed through the field. It sounded like metal scraping against metal, but there was no machinery around. The entire team froze, staring in disbelief as the old scoreboard, untouched for years, lit up by itself. The numbers on the board flickered erratically, finally settling on a score of 0 to 0 inches, with the clock counting down from 5 minutes. "Get off the field," one of Greg's teammates screamed, but no one moved. They were paralyzed, not just with fear, but by some invisible force that seemed to glue them in place. Suddenly, from the fog, emerged shadowy figures, clad in tattered old football uniforms. Their faces were obscured, but their eyes glowed a dull red in the darkness. Without a word, the figures lined up opposite the team, as if challenging them to a game. The air grew colder as they took their positions, their helmets tilted unnaturally forward, as if weighed down by something unseen. The coach, now white-faced and trembling, shouted for everyone to run, but his voice was drowned out by the sudden blast of a whistle. The figures charged forward with inhuman speed, tackling the players with bone-crushing force. Greg felt his body slam into the ground, but the pain was the least of his worries. The shadows didn't just tackle, they absorbed. His teammate next to him screamed as one of the figures enveloped him, pulling him into its dark, swirling form, leaving nothing behind but his helmet. Panic set in as players scrambled to escape, but the fog thickened, cutting off every exit. Greg managed to crawl toward the goalpost, but when he looked back, he saw the figures dragging his coach into the shadows. The scoreboard buzzed again, and the clock hit 0. In that moment, the fog lifted, the shadows disappeared, and Greg was left standing alone on the field, surrounded by the abandoned helmets and jerseys of his team. No one ever found the missing players or coach. The town wrote them off as a tragic accident, but Greg knew the truth. That field wasn't abandoned by choice. It had claimed souls before, and now it had claimed more. Some places are abandoned for a reason. Ignoring the warnings of the past can awaken forces that will not rest until they've claimed what they came for. Ryan had always dreamed of playing college football. When he received a scholarship offer from a small historic university, he jumped at the chance, despite its remote location and eerie campus. The school's football program had a proud history, but it was also plagued by rumors of a ghostly player who haunted the locker room. A tragic accident decades earlier had claimed the life of a star player, and some said his spirit never left the field. Ryan wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, and during the first few weeks of practice, everything seemed normal. But as the season wore on, strange things began to happen. It started small. Locker doors slamming shut, equipment going missing, and cold drafts sweeping through the locker room despite the warm weather. Ryan brushed it off, thinking it was just nerves or pranks from the other players. One night, after a particularly intense practice, Ryan was the last one in the locker room. He was exhausted, his body aching, when he noticed something strange. One of the lockers, old and rusted, stood slightly ajar, though no one had touched it. Curious, Ryan approached it, but as he reached out to close it, the door swung open with a loud creak. Inside was an old, dusty football jersey, the number 13 inches emblazoned on the back. Ryan frowned, unsure why the sight of the jersey made him so uneasy. Suddenly the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. The air grew thick and cold, and a soft rhythmic tapping echoed through the room, like cleats on concrete. Ryan's heart pounded as he backed away, his breath visible in the freezing air. Out of the darkness, a figure appeared. It was a player, tall, muscular, wearing an old-fashioned uniform that didn't match the team's modern gear. The number 13 inches gleamed faintly on the back of his jersey, and his helmet was tilted downward, obscuring his face. Ryan's body froze as the player approached him, the tapping of his cleats echoing louder with each step. "Who are you?" Ryan stammered, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it stopped just inches away from him, its head slowly lifting to reveal a hollow, dark void where its face should have been. Ryan stumbled back, his legs shaking as the figure raised its hand, pointing towards the field. "You owe me a game," the phantom player whispered, his voice low and raspy, like wind through dead leaves. Ryan turned and bolted from the locker room, his feet barely touching the ground as he raced out onto the field. But the figure was there, waiting for him at the 50-yard line. The lights around the stadium flickered to life, illuminating the field in an unnatural glow. Ryan had no choice but to play. The game was grueling, each hit from the phantom player harder than the last, as if he was reliving his own tragic end. With every tackle, Ryan felt his strength drain, his body growing weaker, but the phantom remained relentless. Finally, with one final crushing blow, Ryan collapsed on the field, gasping for breath. The phantom player stood over him, his hollow gaze piercing into Ryan's soul. "You're done," the player whispered before vanishing into the night. Ryan woke up in the hospital the next day, bruised and battered. No one believed his story about the phantom player, dismissing it as a bad dream or heat exhaustion. But Ryan knew the truth. The ghost of the player would forever haunt the field, waiting for another unsuspecting victim to finish the game he never could. Moral: the spirits of the past often seek closure, but their unfinished business can become a living nightmare for those who cross their path. Liam loved football, and as the captain of his high school team, he had big dreams of leading his team to the state championship. But as the season progressed, something strange began to happen during their home games. The stands, normally filled with cheering fans, started to feel off, like there were more people watching than just the visible crowd. At first, Liam chalked it up to the nerves, but during one particular game, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time he glanced toward the bleachers, he saw shadowy figures seated in the highest rows, watching the game in eerie silence. No one else seemed to notice, and when he pointed them out to his teammates, they laughed it off. But as the game went on, the figures multiplied, filling the stands with their dark presence. They didn't move, didn't cheer, just sat there, watching in silence. Liam's skin crawled as he realized that these weren't living fans. They were something else, something ancient and malevolent. By halftime, Liam was pale and shaken, his focus shattered. He couldn't concentrate on the game, not with those shadowy figures looming over the field. Desperate for answers, he approached the team's old equipment manager, a man who had been with the school for decades. The old man sighed heavily when Liam asked about the silent fans. "They've been here for as long as the fields existed," the old man said, his voice low and grave. "Some say they're the spirits of those who died here. Players, fans, maybe even those who helped build the stadium. They come back to watch the games, to relive their glory. But they're not happy." Liam's heart sank. "What do they want?" he asked. The old man shook his head. "No one knows. But if they're watching you, you'd better play the best game of your life. They're judging you." That night, Liam returned to the field for the second half of the game. The shadowy figures were still there, filling every corner of the bleachers. Their presence weighed heavily on him, but he knew he had no choice. He had to play, and he had to win. But with every step he took, it felt like the shadows were closing in on him, sapping his strength and his will to fight. Liam pushed through the fear, playing harder than he ever had before. But in the final moments of the game, as he went for the winning touchdown, he felt a cold, icy hand brush against his arm. The ball slipped from his fingers, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The game was lost, and as Liam collapsed onto the field, the silent fans in the stands began to rise. One by one, they disappeared into the darkness. Their judgment passed. Liam never played football again after that night. He knew he had been tested, and he had failed. The spirits of the field would never let him forget it. Sometimes the past isn't just a memory. It's an active presence that watches, waits, and judges. When playing with the spirits of the past, the stakes are far greater than just winning or losing. The past is never truly forgotten, especially when it involves tragedy or unfinished business. These stories remind us that while football is a game of physical strength, the psychological toll of disturbing forces beyond our understanding can be far more terrifying.